He had all the money in the world, but he couldn't buy a smile from his own daughter. She had been living in deep silence since her mother's death. His solution? Hiring and firing nannies, until one of them, the most unlikely of all, arrived to change the rules of the game. She didn't bring techniques, she brought empathy, and what she taught wasn't a subject, it was a connection. This is the story of how love, in its most silent form, shouted the loudest inside a luxury mansion. Want to know how it all happened? So before continuing, subscribe to the channel, like it, and tell me which city you're listening from. The air in the Kingsley garden that autumn afternoon carried an unusual density, a mixture of the smell of damp earth and the restrained fragrance of the last roses of the season, which clung stubbornly to their stems. To any inattentive observer, it would be just another perfectly orchestrated day in the opulent Kensington mansion. The lawn, so immaculately green that it seemed like a tapestry, spread out like a stage, waiting for its main act. The trees, pruned with almost mathematical precision, framed the scene, their leaves beginning to take on the fiery and golden hues of the season. However, for the few present, that silence was not one of peace, but of an almost unbearable expectation. Each breeze that gently stirred the leaves seemed like a whisper of doubt or hope. This garden, which had always been Edward Kingsley's pride and joy, and a symbol of his ability to impose order and beauty on nature, was about to become the setting for something he could never control, the manifestation of a soul that he himself had helped to silence. The pale London sun peeked through the clouds, casting beams of light that looked like spotlights onto a small wooden platform set up in the center of the lawn. Edward Kingsley felt the expensive fabric of his tailored suit like heavy, ill-fitting armor. His hands, which had usually signed multi-million-dollar contracts with unwavering firmness, were now clammy and clenched into discreet fists in his trouser pockets. He watched the scene from a measured distance, close enough to intervene, but far enough away not to suffocate the fragile moment that was unfolding. A part of him, the part that had built an empire from nothing, screamed that this was madness, an unnecessary and humiliating exposure. He was willingly giving up control, something that went against every fiber of his being. This garden, his domain, suddenly felt like foreign territory. His eyes did not see the flowers or the grass, but the face of his late wife, and then that of his daughter Ava, with the empty eyes that had become her trademark after the tragedy. The memory of the night he had read Grace's blue notebook, feeling the weight of her neglect like a physical blow, was still fresh. It was this pain, this newfound guilt, that kept him there motionless, betting everything on that moment. Not far from him, but in a completely different emotional universe, stood Grace Miller. She wore not a uniform but a simple cotton dress, a soft color that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Her posture was one of watchful calm, a beacon of tranquility in the midst of this sea of tension. Her shoulders were relaxed, but her gaze was entirely focused on Ava, the small figure who was the center of it all. Grace was not thinking about the success or failure of this moment in terms of validating her methods. Her heart beat in a rhythm that was a silent prayer for the little girl. Fragments of her own life flashed through her mind, the nights she had patiently taught her younger sister sign language, the frustration and joy contained in each small communicative victory. She recognized in Ava the same depth, the same desperate need to be understood beyond the barriers of sound or speech. Her hands held nothing, but everyone could feel that she was extending an invisible tether of safety to the child, a connection that needed no touch or words to exist. Ava, meanwhile, was in her own world, a sensory cocoon known only to her. The slightly scratchy fabric of her new dress, chosen by Grace because it had a texture she could tolerate, brushed against her knees as she sat on a small cushion on the floor. The low murmur of the few guests was like the distant buzz of bees, a sound she could register and file away without it intruding on her. Her eyes didn't focus on any particular face. Instead, they tracked the patterns of light on the ground and the way a single red leaf trembled on the tip of a twig. The world to Ava was a tapestry of pure sensation. The coolness of the air on her cheeks, the smell of freshly cut grass, Grace's solid, calming presence in her peripheral vision. She felt no pressure of expectation, for Grace had shielded her from it over the weeks. For Ava, this moment was not a performance. It was simply a continuation of her afternoons in the bedroom, a safe ritual she was about to perform, unaware that for the first time her inner world would be revealed. The guests were few, a deliberate decision by Edward to minimize the pressure on his daughter. There was Dr. Albright, the renowned child therapist who, with all his academic wisdom, had declared Ava a lost cause, an unreachable child. His expression was one of polite skepticism, a professional curiosity that barely concealed the certainty that he was about to witness an embarrassing failure. Beside him, a longtime associate of Edward's, a man accustomed to seeing Kingsley dominate any room, now looked at his boss with an expression of pure confusion. And a little further away, with a rigid posture that seemed to rival that of the pruned trees, was Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper. Her face was a mask of disapproval. For her, this was the final breakdown of order, the surrender of the logic and discipline that governed the mansion to a cheap and ineffective sentimentality brought by this young outsider. The tension between these few people was almost palpable, a force field of doubt and judgment surrounding the small oasis of calm Grace had created. Then, with a barely perceptible nod from Grace, a delicate sound began to float across the garden. It wasn't a stately classical piece, but a simple, repetitive piano melody, played from a small speaker hidden near a flower bed. It was the same song Grace had played on her phone during her sessions with Ava, a melody that had become the soundtrack to the safe haven they had built together. The sound acted as an instant trigger. To Dr. Albright, it was simplistically therapeutic. To Mrs. Hawthorne, it was irritatingly childish. But to Edward, each note was like a hammer blow to his chest, the terrifying prelude to the unknown. He saw Ava's shoulders relax a fraction, a tiny reaction that only a careful observer would notice. The music was the bridge, the first piece of the puzzle being put into place. It was the signal that the waiting time was over and the real test was about to begin, not for Ava, but for everyone watching her. As the first notes of that melody reached Edward's mind, he was transported back to the solitude of his office 3 weeks ago. The image was vivid. The untouched bottle of whiskey on the desk, the cold light of the lamp illuminating the pages of Grace's blue notebook, which he had angrily confiscated before he had fired her. He remembered leafing through the pages, hoping to find evidence of her incompetence, but what he found shattered him. There was no technical jargon or progress reports. There were drawings, little sketches Grace had made for Ava, and next to them, Ava's attempts to replicate them. There was a pressed flower Ava had given her. There were descriptions of how Ava's eyes would light up when she saw a squirrel, or how she arranged her notebooks to represent her mother's absence, and the entry that broke him. Today, she showed me the grey notebook and put it away from the others. I think the grey notebook is sadness. She doesn't want anyone to touch her. At that moment, the steel businessman broke down, the silent, convulsive cry of a man who realized that in his quest for control, he had lost the only thing that mattered. Back in the present, buoyed by the familiarity of the music, Ava made her first move. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Her hand rose from her knee and she turned slowly, crawling the few feet that separated her from a small, low wooden table. The movement was not that of a child running toward a toy, but that of a priest approaching an altar. Every inch was covered with a deliberate concentration that silenced even Dr. Albright's skeptical thoughts. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to scream, to run, to shield his daughter from the gaze of everyone, but he was paralyzed by the quiet strength emanating from her. It was the first time he had seen her move with such clear purpose in any setting other than the isolation of her bedroom. That short walk across the lawn felt longer and more meaningful than any journey he had ever made in his life. The entire world seemed to shrink, focusing on that small figure in her light dress. Grace remained exactly where she was. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even change her expression. Her job in that moment was to be the anchor, the constant in Ava's changing universe. She was living proof that trust wasn't built with orders or instructions, but with presence. Her eyes never left the girl, but her gaze wasn't one of expectation. It was a look of knowledge. She knew what each of those objects on the table meant. She knew the story behind every color, every shape. Her hardest work had already been done in the hundreds of silent hours spent on Ava's bedroom floor, simply existing beside her, offering tools without demanding results. Now, she was simply the guardian of that safe space. Her stillness was her greatest action, a demonstration of absolute faith in Ava's ability to express herself on her own terms. It was a silent lesson to Edward and to everyone else. Sometimes the most profound way to help is to simply step back and trust. Finally, Ava reached the table. On the pale wooden surface was a collection of seemingly random objects that formed the vocabulary of her silent world. There was a series of large square cards, each one a solid, vibrant color. A deep red, a deep ocean blue, a bright yellow like the sun, a dull gray, and a pure white. Next to the cards were 3 wooden blocks of different sizes, a large and imposing one, a small and delicate one, and a medium-sized one. And finally, a small vase with a single white daisy, freshly picked. To the guests, it was a childish and meaningless arrangement. To Edward, who now understood the symbolism thanks to the notebook, each object was a word, a phrase, a feeling. Ava's small hand hovered over the colored cards, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of her own concentration. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which word she would choose first to tell her story. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. Ava's small hand, which had been trembling in the air before, came down with surprising certainty. Her fingers, thin and pale, didn't hesitate. They closed over the edge of the grey card. The gesture was so deliberate that the soft sound of the cardboard scraping against the wood of the table seemed to echo through the silent garden. She lifted it, holding it in both hands, as if presenting irrefutable proof. To Dr. Albright, it was just the choice of a neutral color, perhaps at random. To Mrs. Hawthorne, it was confirmation of the child's dark and depressed nature. But to Edward, who now had the key to deciphering that silent code thanks to Grace's notebook, that simple gray card was a punch in the gut. Gray was sadness. Gray was the world after his wife's departure. It wasn't a color, it was a state of being, the thick fog that had swallowed his daughter, and he, in his arrogance, had never really seen it. He felt a chill run down his spine, a cold realization that he was about to witness a confession, the most honest he had ever seen. Ava was not content to simply hold the card. With equal solemnity, she leaned forward and placed it delicately in the center of the small wooden platform that served as a stage. That gray square, now lying on the pale wood, became the cornerstone of her narrative, the starting point of everything. As soon as she let go of it, she did something no one expected. She lifted her face, not to meet anyone's eyes, but to look directly at the cloudy London sky. Her head lolled slightly to the side, and her lips parted, making no sound. It was a gesture of recognition, as if she were showing everyone the vastness of that sadness, a force as great and overwhelming as the sky itself. In that moment, everyone in the garden, Even the skeptical housekeeper understood that this was not a game. It was a map of grief, and Ava was pointing to its epicenter, a grief that filled all space, visible and invisible. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of that raw feeling. Then Ava's focus shifted to the wooden blocks. Her hand hovered for a moment before moving with the same determination as before, selecting the largest, heaviest block. It was a solid piece of oak with sharp edges and an imposing presence. The block that, Edward knew with a certainty that stung him, represented him. He watched, mesmerized and terrified, as his daughter picked up the miniature representation of him. She did not treat it kindly. She held it tightly and, crossing the platform, placed it on the farthest point of the grey card, at the opposite end of the small stage. The physical distance between the two objects was a silent scream, an abyss. Edward felt the air leave his lungs. He was seeing his own emotional absence, his calculated distance, translated into the simplest and most brutal language available. He was that block. Large, strong, present, but completely isolated from the core pain of his own family. Shame hit him like a wave, hot and suffocating. Ava's gaze returned to the remaining blocks. Her hand, this time with visible tenderness, moved toward the smallest, most delicate block, made of a lighter wood, its edges smoothed from handling. Her mother. She held the small block as if it were a wounded bird, her tiny fingers caressing the smooth surface. She slowly brought it closer to the grey card, the symbol of grief. For a moment it seemed as if she would place it beside it, a close but separate memory. But her next gesture was the one that shattered Edward's heart into a million pieces. With agonizing slowness, she laid the small block directly on the surface of the grey card, partially covering it. The message was unmistakable, an image of devastating clarity. Her mother was not just associated with grief, she had been consumed by it, had become one with it. Cause and effect merged into a single symbol. A lone tear escaped Grace's eyes, but she made no move to wipe it away, her stillness a tribute to the little storyteller's courage. The visual narrative continued to unfold with relentless logic. Ava turned to the colored cards once more. This time she selected the white card, pristine and empty. Grace had written on it, "For Ava, white is not peace, it is silence. It is the empty space where something should be." She took the white card and, with surgical precision, placed it in the open space on the platform, creating a bridge of emptiness between her father's block on its far edge and the fusion of her mother's block with the card of sadness. She had just drawn the anatomy of her loneliness. A vast field of nothingness separating her from her father, while her heart remained anchored in the pain of loss. Edward took an involuntary step back, as if physically pushed. He was staring at a portrait of his own failure, the visual representation of the abyss he had allowed to grow, the emotional void in which his daughter had been left to float alone. The accusation was silent, but louder than any scream. There was one last block on the table, a medium-sized one, neither as imposing as her father's nor as delicate as her mother's. Her. Ava picked up the block that represented her and held it in her lap for a long moment. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight, its texture. The entire garden seemed to stop breathing, anticipating where she would place herself in this desolate landscape she had created. The answer came to her with a clarity that hurt. She reached out and placed her own block directly in the center of the white card, in the middle of the void. There she was, a small child, lost in the vastness of loneliness, a point of precarious existence between an emotionally unavailable father and a mother who had become grief. The picture was complete. It was a perfect, silent diorama of her family's tragedy, a map of her soul that no therapist with his charts and assessments had ever been able to draw. The skepticism on Dr. Albright's face finally dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure wonder and professional humility. And then, just when everyone thought the story had ended in desolation, something changed. Ava's energy, once slow and solemn, became lighter, almost quicker. Her eyes sparkled with new intent as her hands moved toward the deep blue card, the color Grace had introduced into her world. The blue of the notebook, the blue of calm, of undemanding presence. She took the card and, instead of immediately placing it on the platform, she held it up against the pale light. For an instant, the card glowed with a rich, vibrant color, a jarring contrast to the gray, white, and wood palette that dominated the scene. It was the first injection of bright color into her story, a visible sign that the landscape of her grief was no longer static. That simple gesture heralded a change, the arrival of a new force into her universe, the quiet, steady force of Grace. What Ava did next was what made Edward's jaw drop. Holding the blue card, she slid it across the wooden platform like a bridge. She started next to her own block, the block of the me lost in the void. The blue card touched its representation. Then, with a concentrated effort, she continued to push it across the white space, the territory of loneliness, until the other end of the card gently touched the large, imposing block of her father. She had built a bridge, a blue bridge of empathy and connection across the chasm of neglect. Edward felt a sob rise in his throat, a sound he swallowed with difficulty. He was seeing, in real time, the miracle Grace had performed. She had not healed Ava. She had given her the tools to build a path back, not just to the world, but to him. That simple gesture was the representation of weeks of patience, of listening, and of a faith he himself had never had. The story was now picking up a hopeful pace. With the blue bridge firmly in place, Ava picked up the bright yellow card, the color of newfound joy that Grace had documented, and placed it beside the bridge, like a sun rising over the landscape. Then her hands went to the last card, the heart red, the most intense and vulnerable color of all, love. She had held this card longer than any other object. And then, in a movement that made time stand still for Edward, she lifted her head, and her eyes met his. It was the first time in years, direct, fearless eye contact that lasted only a second but contained a lifetime of longing. With that gaze still in the air, she leaned forward and placed the red card directly on the large pad, her father's pad. It wasn't an accusation. It was a gift, a declaration that despite everything, love was still there, waiting to be reached. The construction was finished. The map of her journey from grief to connection was complete for all to see. But there was one last element on the table, unnoticed until now, the small vase with the single white daisy. With a delicacy that seemed sacred, Ava picked up the tiny flower by its stem. She held it in front of her face for a moment, as if to inhale its subtle fragrance, or perhaps to say goodbye to the world of symbols she had just manipulated. Then, with a resolve that seemed to come from a place deep within her, she stood. Her legs, a little unsteady, steadied her on the soft grass. She turned, leaving behind the table, the platform, and her history of blocks and colors. She passed Grace, offering her a quick look of reassurance, and began to walk. She did not walk aimlessly. She walked in a straight, determined line toward the figure of her father, who stood frozen, his heart exposed and his breath held, while his daughter crossed the chasm to meet him. Each step Ava took across the lawn was a seismic event in Edward's universe. He could see her little white slippers sinking slightly into the damp grass, moving forward with a determination he had never witnessed before. The distance between them, which had previously been an abyss of silence and neglect, was now shrinking with every passing second, and this shrinking of space was the most terrifying and wonderful thing he had ever experienced. For Ava, the journey was a sensory tunnel. The world around her, the faces of the guests, the distant sound of London traffic, the rustle of leaves, vanished. There was only the texture of the grass beneath her feet, the fragile stem of the daisy between her fingers, and the imposing figure of her father, who grew with each step, becoming the sole focal point of her existence. The walk was not long in meters, but in meaning. It was the crossing of an ocean of pain. Inside Edward, a lifetime of certainties was crumbling. The armor of control, forged in boardrooms, and the brutal loss of his wife, was crumbling, revealing the terrified man beneath. Every step Ava took was a hammer blow to his facade. He was no longer the tycoon Edward Kingsley. He was just a father, naked and exposed in the middle of his own garden. Flashes of memory assaulted him, the weight of Ava in his arms as a baby, the smell of talcum powder and innocence. The day her silence began, a silence he interpreted as a reflection of his own inability to feel and so avoided confronting. He felt an overwhelming urge to run toward her, to speed up this encounter, but his feet felt anchored to the ground. He was paralyzed by the realization that he was not the protagonist of this story. He was just a play, and for the first time he was ceding control to a much greater force, his daughter's courage. She stopped, 3 feet away from him. So close he could see the pale sunlight reflecting off her brown hair. So close he could see the small speck of dirt on her knee. The whole world seemed to hold its breath along with him. The girl, his daughter, who for years had been a ghostly presence in the house, was there solid and real and full of purpose. And then she lifted her hand. The small white daisy was offered, suspended in the space between them. It was not a demand. It was not an accusation. It was an invitation. An end to the story she had told on the platform and the beginning of a new one. The silence that fell was not empty. It was thick, vibrant, full of everything that had gone unsaid for years. Edward looked at the flower, then at her face, and saw there a serenity he had not known she possessed. In that instant he realized that his own hands, the hands of a man who shaped the world to his will, were shaking uncontrollably. A decision formed in his mind, born not of logic, but of a primal instinct he had long suppressed. To stand, to accept the flower as an equal, would be to keep his distance, would be to reaffirm the hierarchy that had caused so much harm. And so Edward Kingsley, the man who made others tremble, the pillar of strength and intransigence, did the unthinkable. He bent his knees. The expensive fabric of his trousers protested, but he did not care. He knelt on the damp grass of his own garden, the sound of his knees sinking into the earth, the only noise in the absolute silence. He lowered himself not in humiliation, but in an act of pure, desperate surrender. For the first time, he was not looking down on his daughter, but was on her level. He was finally meeting her where she was. That simple act of kneeling was his first word of love in years. Their eyes were level now. He could see the complexity of the brown in her eyes, the way her pupils dilated slightly at the sight of him standing so close. He was no longer the imposing, frightening figure. It was just her father, kneeling in the grass. His trembling hand reached out, not for the flower, but for her hand. His large, calloused fingers touched her small, delicate fingers holding the stem. It was an electric touch, a current of years of distance being annihilated in a single second. Her skin was cold. His was feverish. She did not flinch. Her fingers relaxed, and the daisy passed from her hand into his. The transfer was more than just an object. It was the passing of a baton, the giving of a hope, the acceptance of a forgiveness he had not known he needed to ask for. He held the tiny flower as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. And it was at that moment, as he looked down at the flower in her hand and then back up at her eyes, that the true miracle happened. A miracle that not even Grace, in her wildest hopes, had dared to foresee. Ava's lips parted. A small puff of air escaped, followed by a sound. It wasn't a clear word, polished by practice. It was a guttural sound, rough with disuse, a monumental effort that made a small vein throb in her forehead. A sound that struggled to come out of a throat that had grown accustomed to silence, but the intent was unmistakable. Raspy, weak, almost a broken whisper, the sound shaped itself into a single syllable that hit Edward with the force of an explosion. "Father!" The word hung in the air for a second, fragile and powerful, before dissolving, leaving a trail of pure emotional devastation in its wake. That single syllable was the dam that broke. Edward's already shattered composure was completely obliterated. A sob escaped his chest, an ugly, raw sound that had none of the restraint he had always displayed. The tears he had held back for years since his wife's death finally found their way, streaming down his face in hot trails of relief and agony. The tiny daisy fell from his fingers, forgotten in the grass. His arms, once rigid at his sides, moved with desperate urgency, enveloping Ava's small body in a hug that was anything but gentle. It was the hug of a drowning man who had just found his only lifeline. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of childhood he had almost forgotten, and the sound of her sobs was the only response he could make to her words. Any other child, especially one with Ava's sensitivity, might have been startled by the ferocity of that embrace, by the intensity of her father's pain, but Ava didn't flinch. She didn't stiffen. In that awkward, overwhelming embrace, she felt something she had never felt in the measured touches of therapists or the distant care of nannies. She felt truth. It was a touch that asked nothing, that didn't try to fix or analyze. It was the pure, chaotic expression of a love that had finally found an outlet, and then, in response, she did something as meaningful as her first word. Her small body, which had always been a bundle of pent-up tension, relaxed. She leaned against her father's chest, her face pressed into the fabric of his suit, and went completely still. She didn't hug him back, but she accepted him. She allowed herself to be held. In that embrace, the girl who had been in a constant storm finally found a safe haven. The scene silenced the garden for good. Dr. Albright stood with his mouth slightly open, his horn-rimmed glasses looking absurd in the face of such a primitive and human event. All his theory, all his diagnoses were like dust in the face of this display of connection that defied clinical explanation. He was witnessing the healing of the soul, something no book had prepared him for. Edward's partner, a man who had known only his ruthless side, watched with an expression of awe and reverence, as if he were watching a man being born again. And Mrs. Hawthorne, the guardian of order and rigidity, finally broke. Her erect posture sagged, her shoulders slumped slightly, and her mask of disapproval dissolved into stunned wonder. She was seeing irrefutable proof that love, in its messiest and most unpredictable form, was a force more powerful than any rule she had ever tried to impose. And Grace, the catalyst for it all, stood motionless at the wooden table, a silent spectator of the miracle she had helped to cultivate. Tears streamed freely down her face, but a soft smile played on her lips. She felt no pride or need to claim credit. She felt a deep, overwhelming gratitude. Her work was done. She had built the bridge, but the crossing, the courage to take the first steps, had belonged entirely to Ava and Edward. She watched them, father and daughter, clinging to each other amid the ruins of their old pain, and she knew this moment was not about her. She was the scaffolding that is removed when the structure is firm. Her presence now was only a silent blessing, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest form of love is to give others the tools to save themselves. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please leave a like and most importantly subscribe to the channel. This helps a lot for those of us who are just starting out and continuing. The embrace lasted an eternity and an instant. Slowly, as if handling the most delicate glass, Edward loosened his grip. He kept his hands on Ava's small shoulders, holding her at arm's length so he could look at her. Her face, streaked with tears and redness, no longer wore its mask of calculated coldness. It was open, devastated, and for the first time incredibly human. His eyes, which had always seemed distant and analytical, were now clear, focused only on her. With a trembling finger, he brushed away a stray strand of hair that had fallen across her forehead. It was a gesture of tenderness so simple, so instinctive, and so absent for years that it felt like it carried the weight of 1,000,000 unspoken words. He wasn't fixing a problem. He was caring for his daughter. That small touch was the signing of a peace treaty with his own heart. Ava did not try to speak again. That monumental effort to utter a single word had drained her reserves, but it had opened a floodgate. A new light shone in her eyes, a curiosity that had replaced the veil of indifference. She looked at her father's face, really seeing him, and then her gaze dropped to the grass. She saw the small white daisy, forgotten and crumpled beside his knee. Her small arm reached up, and her index finger pointed to the flower. There was no sound, only the gesture. It was the beginning of a new form of communication, no longer based on complex symbols of pain, but on the simplicity of the here and now. A request, an observation, a shared interest. It was a conversation, and Edward knew that he had been invited to participate, perhaps for the first time in his life. Following her pointed finger, Edward saw the flower. With the solemnity of one gathering a sacred artifact, he plucked it from the grass. The petals were slightly crumpled, but it still held its shape. He held it for a moment, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time, and then, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, he offered it back to Ava. "It's yours," he said, his voice husky and cracked with emotion. It wasn't a command or an instruction. It was an acknowledgement. He was returning to her the gift she had given him, but now with a new meaning. It was a cycle of giving and receiving, a silent dialogue of gestures. Ava took the flower and held it close to her face, her small fingers tracing the edges of the petals, peaceful. That moment sealed the new dynamic between them. He was no longer the director, but a willing participant in the dance. Slowly, the world around him began to take shape. Edward became dimly aware of the other figures standing in the garden, witnesses to his complete unmaking. The old version of himself would have cringed in shame, furious at such an exposure of vulnerability. But the man kneeling on the grass felt none of that. The shame had been washed away by tears. There was only a sense of release. He stood, his movement stiff with position and emotion, and reached out to his daughter. Ava took it without hesitation. Her small, trusting hand in his was the only anchor he needed. Standing side by side, they were no longer the portrait of tragedy, but the fragile outline of a new beginning. He didn't mind the stares. In fact, he welcomed them as confirmation that the change was real and visible. His gaze swept the small group and found Grace's. She still stood near the table, a quiet, steady presence. No words passed between them, but the connection was deeper than any conversation. There was an ocean of gratitude in Edward's eyes. There was a silent apology for his arrogance, for his doubt, for pushing her away. There was a deep respect, a king's recognition of a strength his power and money could never buy. He inclined his head in a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture from a boss to an employee, but from a man to another human being who had saved his soul. The nod was a promise that he would not waste this gift, this second chance she had made possible. Grace acknowledged the nod, and a small, genuine, tired smile lit her face. She understood. Her purpose here was fulfilled. With the same discretion with which she had always moved through the mansion, she bent down and picked up her canvas bag and the inseparable blue notebook she had left on the grass. She did not address Edward with formalities or farewells. This moment was entirely his and Ava's. Turning, she began walking, not toward the mansion's imposing front door, but toward a smaller side gate, an exit path that was as humble and effective as she was. Her departure was like the tide receding after depositing a treasure on the shore, silent, natural, and leaving behind a landscape forever changed. On the way to the gate, her path took her past Mrs. Hawthorne. The housekeeper, who had always watched her with an eagle's eye full of disdain, now wore a different expression. Her usual rigidity had been eroded by the scene she had witnessed. As Grace passed, the older woman dropped her gaze for a moment and murmured, the words barely audible, but clear in the silence of the garden. I was wrong. It wasn't a full apology, but coming from this woman, it was the equivalent of total capitulation. Grace paused for a second, looked at her without judgment, only with weary understanding, and gave a slight nod before continuing on her way. The shockwave of that moment was spreading, shattering even the most rigid structures of the house. Grace's departure seemed to be the signal for the others to leave as well. Edward's partner approached, and instead of the usual formal handshake, he placed a firm hand on Kingsley's shoulder, a gesture of genuine solidarity that transcended business. "Take care, Edward," he said softly, and left. Next came Dr. Albright, his face as if his faith in science had just been shaken and yet restored. "I have studied the human mind for 30 years, he confessed, his voice low. "But what I have seen here today, it is not in the books. You have an extraordinary daughter." With that admission, he too left, leaving behind a silence that was no longer one of tension, but of introspection. The public spectacle was over, giving way to the fragile and sacred reality of private life. And then it was just them, Edward and Ava, hand in hand in the middle of the vast garden. The sun, now lower on the horizon, painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, and shadows lengthened across the grass. The air was chilly, but Edward didn't feel it. He looked at the small wooden platform with its collection of colored blocks and cards, the map of their pain, the gray of sadness, the white of emptiness, the large, distant block that was him. Before, he would have ordered it all removed immediately to erase the evidence of the disorder. Now he saw it as a memorial, a shrine to the moment when his real life had truly begun. He finally understood the story because he was part of it now. Ava, the daisy still in her other hand, gave her father's hand a gentle tug. She led him not toward the cold, imposing house, but to the side, toward a large weeping willow tree whose branches fell like a green curtain to the ground. It was a secret place, a refuge that Grace had discovered she loved. Edward followed her without question. They sat together on the grass beneath the shelter of the tree, hidden from the rest of the world. They were silent, but it was a new silence. It was not the absence of sound that separated them, but a shared stillness that united them. It was the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to know they were together. This was the true beginning, not in the drama of the lawn, but in the peace beneath the tree. Sitting there, with the comforting weight of his daughter's hand in his, Edward felt the truth of his life settle over him with brutal clarity. His relentless pursuit of control had never been a sign of strength, but a symptom of paralyzing fear. Fear of feeling the pain of losing his wife, fear of facing his daughter's silence, fear of his own inner emptiness. His perfectly ordered mansion, his thriving business, had all been an elaborate distraction from looking within. He finally understood that love wasn't about providing or protecting from afar or imposing order. It was about being present. It was about the vulnerability of kneeling in the grass, the humility of learning a new language, and the courage to simply sit quietly with the one you love without the need to fix anything. He looked at Ava. She was now completely absorbed, tracing the veins of a fallen leaf with her finger. He knew with a calm certainty that their journey was just beginning. The word father would not be followed by complete sentences tomorrow. Silence would still be a big part of her world. There would be frustrations, challenges, and hard days. But the fundamental difference, the tectonic shift that had occurred that day, was that fear had disappeared from the equation. In its place was now an infinite patience and a love that was no longer conditional or distant. He was no longer afraid of her silence. On the contrary, he was eager to learn to hear it in all its nuances, in all its colors. The garden, his garden, would never be the same to him again. It was no longer a monument to his wealth or a demonstration of his power over nature. It had become a sacred place. That immaculate lawn was the soil where his soul had broken and remade itself. The flowers, once mere decorative objects, were now the silent witnesses of his surrender and redemption. That space, once barren of genuine emotion, had been baptized by the most real, messy, and beautiful moment of his life. It had become the birthplace of Edward Kingsley, his father, a man who had finally learned that true order lies not in the perfection of the landscape, but in the messy and priceless connection of the heart. Much later that night, when the house was still, Edward found Grace's blue notebook on the hall table, exactly where she had left it. He picked it up, not with the anger it had once been, but with the reverence of one holding a sacred text. In his study, he opened it. The pages were filled not with clinical analyses, but with life. The drawings of suns and houses, the notes about how Ava liked the feel of wool but not cotton, the small pressed flower he now recognized. It was the guide, the instruction manual for his daughter's soul, a legacy of empathy left by a young woman he barely knew but to whom he owed everything. He would not put it in a drawer. He would keep it close, like a map to the new territory he was learning to navigate. The final image of that day was not one of drama, but of hard-won peace. On the floor of Ava's room, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp, Edward and his daughter sat together. The wooden blocks were scattered between them. They were not reconstructing the story of their pain. They were simply stacking the blocks, one on top of the other, into a rickety tower that made them smile each time it collapsed. In one of those falling moments, a sound escaped Ava. It was not a word. It was a low hum, a sound of pure, uninhibited contentment. Edward looked at her, and a genuine, tired, utterly peaceful smile spread across his face. Within the walls of the cool, elegant Kingsley mansion, which for so long had been just a house, a home was finally and very quietly beginning to be built. Grace's mission was simple: to build a bridge where there was only a chasm, and she did it. Not with words, but with presence, proving that empathy is a universal language. Sometimes life leaves us in silence, not because we have nothing to say, but because no one is willing to listen in the right way. The journey we follow today teaches us that in order to heal, we must first kneel, descend to the level of the other person's pain, and simply be there with an open heart. If this story has changed your way of seeing, just as it forever changed the fate of Ava, Edward, and Grace, join our community. Subscribe to discover other stories that prove one thing: the most powerful connection in the world is the one that doesn't need sound to be felt.